Hi everybody, this is Joshua Kirk back with you guys once again on YouTube, and now it's time for episode 23, I think this is, of Album of the Day, in which once again I'm going to do another classic album review. Yeah, classic albums, as I said, is what I'm going to be reviewing for these next few reviews, and then eventually we'll get into more recent ones that have come out, recently, pretty much, in 2013 or 2014, whatever, that kind of thing. But before we get into the video, I'd just like to thank everybody for all the great attention I've gotten on my previous review, which was on the old 97's album, Wreck Your Life. I think all the nice comments and all the people talking online about it, and all the likes and the thousands of views I've gotten. I'd like to thank all of you for that. But, I decided to go back and do another review, another classic album review, because there's plenty other classic albums out there that I'm definitely considering a review of, so that's why I'm doing it. So today's artist is a band that I've been a fan of for quite a long time now. The band that most of you may know, called the Beatles. They broke up many years ago, but still really timeless music. Even after they broke up, people are still going crazy, celebrating how great musicians they were when they were playing together. The quartet, the Fab Four, the quartet, aka the Fab Four, consisting of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. 2 are alive today. 2 have died, unfortunately, but at least the 2 that have died may rest in peace, because, their music, even though they broke up several years ago, people are still buying their music. In fact, they released remastered Beatles albums in September of 2009, and recently they've released the US albums in little vinyl replicas about a month ago. So that's pretty cool for anyone who's interested in getting a remastered version of the US records. I only have the remastered UK records. I only have the remastered UK records. So anyway, I'm going to review an album of theirs released in late 1967, based off of a film that came out that year that they did. The album was called Magical Mystery Tour. And this was back in the days when, where either the record labels or the corporate business companies forced them to put out at least 2 albums each year. But they didn't really do that every year. In fact, In fact, starting with Revolver, they started releasing only 1 album for a year. So I guess they must have eliminated the rule, because some people couldn't afford to do 2 albums in 1 year. But the Beatles are one of those bands. In fact, there are very few people out there still doing 2 albums per year. So that is a little weird that they decided to put out a couple of albums for a ton of years, but that really doesn't bother me, because the Beatles have put out a lot of great stuff, and I feel like putting 2 albums per year meant that they kept on just putting out their great music that they really took the time and really put the heart into. But anyway, here's the cover of this, the spine and the back. So it has songs in the movie, which are Magical Mystery Tour, The Fool on the Hill, Flying, Blue Jay Way, Your Mother Should Know, and I'm the Walrus. This is pretty funny. Here on the bottom, after I'm the Walrus, it says here, "No, you're not," said little Nicola. That's pretty funny right there. And then there are other songs on here that are not in the movie, but recorded during the same sessions, which are, like it says, plus these other selections in here. And they're Hello, Goodbye, Strawberry Fields Forever, which is one of my favorite Beatles songs ever, Penny Lane, Baby You're a Rich Man, and All You Need Is Love, which totally makes sense, because all you need is love. The Beatles are correct on that one. And this is sort of like the Beatles albums, like their earlier albums and their later albums. Their earlier albums were released on Capitol Records on like Parlophone, but some of their later releases were on Apple Records, I think starting with this one, Magical Mystery Tour. In fact, it says here, like, Apple Presents, and they're known for having that Apple logo there. And this is one of the Beatles remastered 2009 records. I got this for my 9th birthday in January of 2010. In fact, you know, every time I listen to the Beatles, it brings back so many great memories. So I will admit, probably the best part about their music is really the nostalgia that they really bring to the table in their sound, because they are old school anyway. But anyway, there's like the Apple logo there in the sleeve, and there's like a booklet in there, which I'll show soon. There's the Beatles there, and there they are again, like driving in a car. And this was back when, you know, the Beatles started growing mustaches compared to how they looked back then, where they, you know, didn't really have mustaches at all back then. But, you know, I think this just makes them a little cooler that way. But here's the booklet. And I will tell you, I have done, this isn't my first video of the Beatles. In fact, my first Beatles video was back in June of 2012 when I still did videos about movies. I did a video of my Beatles collection. So, but this is my first time, you know, doing a video about the Beatles that, like, has to do with me reviewing just one album of theirs. So there's credits and there's footage from the movie, it looks like. And as you can see here, I'm wearing my Beatles shirt. I got this for my 12th birthday last year. There's lyrics there for just the songs off the movie. In fact, if you want to find the lyrics for the songs that are not in the movie that are on this album, go online, because that's pretty cool, because that's where you can find all the lyrics that aren't included in the physical formats of the albums. And then, let me show you the CD in here. Doesn't have an Apple logo on it, but it does have the Capitol Records logo on it. This was like back in the early days of Capitol Records when this was released, compared to the sort of mainstream days of that label now, with more like poppier artists coming on there nowadays. But anyway, there's the packaging of Magical Mystery Tour. Let me talk about the music. The music on here is excellent. It's definitely one of the more creative Beatles records, because what's interesting is this band started out as like sort of a British pop act that was kind of stripped down to like this type of like creative, pretty nostalgic sounding music, blending in things like some more piano and organ and mellotron and more arrangements, like for example when they started using things like string sections and horn sections and woodwinds, and they started blending in things like piccolo trumpets, and used a ton of weird techniques on their vocals, and plus they've been like blending in some sound effects too. Like if you listen to Revolution 9, they're like, you know, blending in a bunch of tape loops and effects, and like someone in the background saying number 9, number 9, number 9 over and over again. There is a lot of that on Magical Mystery Tour, so they kept on repeating that on the White Album. So it opens up with Magical Mystery Tour, which makes sense because it is the title track and it is the theme song for the film, like during the beginning credits. So Magical Mystery Tour is it's a great opener because it's sort of, it sucks you into the whole album, that's for sure, when it gets a ton of, cowbell percussion and like a ton of harmonies coming in there that you would expect to find on Beatles records. And plus there's like trumpets in the background to accompany the main melody of piano, guitar, bass, and drums. So it really is a great opener for this because it is the title track and the opening song for the movie. The Fool on the Hill is the next song in here, and obviously it talks about, a fool who's on a hill, which people don't like him because, he's, just a fool that just sees the world spinning round and, like, and they can tell that he wants to do foolish things. The arrangements of instruments on this song is great. There's a few flute players on here, along with Paul McCartney playing a recorder, and John and George playing like bass harmonicas, I guess, because if you look online, they did play harmonica on this song, but they don't really sound like traditional harmonicas. They sound more like bass harmonicas, and not really like the traditional harmonica that you can hear a little bit on Please Please Me or with the Beatles, like on their early stuff. And not really like, the harmonica that you hear in the music of like Bob Dylan or anything, but rather like those bass harmonicas like you hear on records like Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. So I think the woodwind arrangements on this song were excellent. And then there's an instrumental called Flying, which is basically nothing but some little cute guitar riffs along with a nice bass line, like the pulsating electric bass, along with the nice drums and sounds sort of like drums with brushes. And then coming in, there's some organ and mellotron played by John Lennon. And then, of course, there's the full band doing like some la-da-da parts towards the end of it. So it's a nice little instrumental for the album. And then there's the psychedelic rock feel of Blue Jay Way, which barely even has a single guitar on it, and just basically has a Hammond organ. A Hammond organ as being the lead instrument in this song. But, it's definitely a cool little psychedelic number, sung by George Harrison, and of course, what a great songwriter he is, what a great vocalist he is, and a great guitar player he is too, even though he didn't play a guitar part on here. He played organ on here. So may the man rest in peace, because he is just an excellent, talented musician. And once it comes in, it's got like, it's pretty much, you can tell this is definitely a pretty psychedelic number because of all the recording effects going on with the song, with the Beatles harmonies, along with like, a weird like backwards, along with weird backwards harmony vocals on here too. And then in the background, there's like some session musician playing a cello, which I think is the perfect accompaniment without overpowering this song. And the song Your Mother Should Know is nice and upbeat, and it's definitely one of the most interesting sort of songwriting subjects, actually. Like, it talks about, like, let's all get up and dance to a song that was a hit before our mother was born. Though she was born a long, long time ago, your mother should know. So, it's sort of an interesting, like, sort of, I don't know if I would call it advice, but it's sort of an interesting message going on with the song. But that's so far the only kind of lyrics you hear in the song. In fact, the Beatles songs tend to be pretty short and don't really have a ton of words, but at least, the music, the interesting things that they do musically really makes up for the fact and keeps it from being just a straight up too short record. The song I'm the Walrus, let me just tell you, that is one of my favorite songs from the Beatles. John Lennon's distorted voice, the really creative and really crafty lyrics of, like, I am the Eggman, they are the Eggman, I'm Walrus, goo 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 joo. Just the creativeness in the lyrics. It's pretty funny how, like, the Beatles are just pretending that John is a walrus. Although, little Nicola says in the film here, no, you're not. Yeah, pretty funny there. And it's got, like, a ton of experimental things going on. Like, there's a string section on here, and there's, like, a choir of 16 voices in the background, too, along with John playing an electric piano. So I think the song is a perfect example of how weird the Beatles can get sometimes. So this is really, just an excellent track. One of my favorites by the Beatles. There are plenty of other songs on here that bring back a ton of memories for me. Hello, Goodbye, and Penny Lane are just two songs that just make me feel like a kid again, just listening to it. Like, trust me, this album, it'll make you dance like it's the 1960s. Like, the 1960s was such a great time because, the Beatles were a big part of that. I wasn't born at that time. I'm only 13 years old, but I definitely do know how big of an impact the Beatles' music had on everybody, so I knew I really had to appreciate what the Beatles had done in their career, on their rather short-lived career. The song Strawberry Fields Forever is another one of my favorites, and it has really cool instruments on it. Like, it has Paul McCartney playing this weird little electronic string keyboard instrument called the mellotron, which I do have musical instruments, and I'd love to buy myself a mellotron, because it's a really unique instrument, so I would love to have one of those one day, so I can, bust out all those, like, cool little, like, sort of, string sounds that may not be like the real thing, but, totally, I would love to experiment with something like that, so hopefully one day I'll get enough money to buy myself a mellotron, because it's really just a really cool instrument. And there's lots of other things going on, like there's some trumpets, some cellos, and George Harrison plays this weird little instrument from India that's like, looks like a harp that I don't know what to pronounce the name of, but it is on here too, and it's, cool to have another weird instrument on here. But at the end of this song, if you listen very carefully, especially with headphones, you'll hear in the background that it sounds like someone saying, like, I buried Paul at the end. That's just hilarious. Like, if you just listen very, very carefully with headphones on to the end of the song, you'll pretty much hear I buried Paul sneaking in the background. Getting into the background. And it's an interesting lyrical subject with Strawberry Fields Forever, where it talks about Strawberry Fields is a place where nothing is real, and they sort of talked a little bit about that in the song Glass Onion off of the White Album, which references a ton of different Beatles songs, especially stuff from here, like in the song Glass Onion, it references The Fool on the Hill, Strawberry Fields Forever, and I'm the Walrus. Like, those are like the few songs off of this album that Glass Onion has like references of in here. And Baby You're a Rich Man has a nice sort of funky feel to it, has this cool little like organ type instrument in the background. It isn't really an organ, but it's something called like, I don't know if clavioline is the right way to pronounce it, but it's like some sort of keyboard instrument that's played on here. Really cool to hear that weird little organ type instrument in the background. Nice little bit of hand claps in the background. And the guitar, bass, piano, and drum tracks on here really, really catchy and make up for a pretty, catchy song that's like easy to stick in your head for a while. And like the chorus of like, baby you're a rich man, baby you're a rich man. I just love that chorus a lot where everybody's like singing. And I swear Mick Jagger is actually singing with them on that chorus. In fact, if you look on Wikipedia, I think Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones was probably singing on here, but I don't know. But I think he was, because I think I saw and heard about that on Wikipedia. So, yeah, I'm assuming I'm correct there. And then it closes off with All You Need Is Love, which sort of makes sense, because all that everybody needs is, love in their hearts and in their soul and stuff. Like, I think it's definitely great advice from the Beatles. All you need is love might sound a little cliche to some. Might sound a little cliche and kind of mundane and cheesy to some, but I think it's just, a great little, like, simple message. In fact, I'm not really too big into, like, love songs, but as far as the Beatles goes, the Beatles, when they do love songs, they actually do it pretty well. They don't make it overly cheesy or make it sound like candy or anything. The way they do love songs is sort of, they took the time to write it and made sure that, it was like a love song without like being like a real corny song or anything like that. And so All You Need Is Love is definitely a perfect example of that. And it's like got a huge orchestra on here. There's horns and strings once again. And then there's like John Lennon playing a harpsichord and, the vocals of like, love, love, love. Like, that really do, make up, for the fact that, the song is really just sort of, making, just sort of, giving people the important advice that they need. That all they really need is like love in the world. So I really liked this album. The guitar and bass riffs are really catchy. The drums on here are nice. The piano on here is very beautifully played. The keyboards on here sound really, really cool. And all the orchestral arrangements on here, like for example, the piccolo trumpet that's on, the piccolo trumpet that's on Penny Lane is really, really great sounding on that song. And Penny Lane is just one of my favorite Beatles songs, along with Hello Goodbye. So this is probably my favorite Beatles record because of the fact that it just has some of my all-time favorite Beatles songs on it. So I'm going to give this one an 8 out of 10. It is literally that good. It's that good. The film has gotten pretty juicy criticism when it came out, but at least they liked the album. In fact, when I read that, people really liked this album and said it was better than the movie, I'm like, well, at least they like the album, because, the album is just so, wonderful. There are just some times where I like crave for something that goes back to the basics, and then other times where I'm just craving something with a ton of instruments on it, and a ton of, cool little effects, and a little bit of humor in there. Like, I think the humor that you hear on this record definitely is excellent without, they're not going too overboard with the humor on this. The humor on this totally, it makes total sense to me. Total sense to me. So I really liked this album. I'd love to hear what all you die-hard Beatles fans think of this album in the comments. I'm a die-hard fan, so I really like this album. But, just let me know what you think in the comments. And once again, give this review a shining 5-star rating. And give me a ton of views and nice comments and email messages. Because that's really what I need from all these reviews that I do. So, I'll see y'all for my next review. But anyway, take care, everybody. Bye, and have a happy President's Day.